My guest today is Michael Sackler, a film producer and the CEO of Supernode Global, an early-stage venture capital firm that invests in media tech. What makes it stand out among other VCs is that they really believe in the community aspect of building a business. In this episode, we talk about how investments into startups are made, synthetic media, and what the future holds. We also discuss why Mike and his company choose to invest in media tech and what potential this industry has. Tune in to learn what's the most important thing while building a startup that makes it attractive to investors and find out what advice Mike has for those wanting to be in the business. I'm Katarzyna Dąbrowska, and it's simple, you know? Joining me today is Michael Sackler, CEO at Supernode Global. Hi, Mike.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. I would start off by asking you, what do you actually do? Because that's usually my first question, but we all know that CEOs wear lots and lots of hats. So I'm going to start off by asking you, what does your company do?
So Supernode Global is a community and VC fund that supports startups in the digital content and communications ecosystem. So we really focus on supporting early stage companies that are shaping the way that we learn, work, play, and communicate. And that takes the form of, on the community side, through obviously access to a great network of mentors and advisors and investors and potential customers and so on, as well as workshops and events and all that sort of good stuff. And then on the VC side, it's obviously access to capital. We tend to get in either at pre-seed or seed stage, and then we support our portfolio companies in a really hands-on and meaningful kind of way. We take a lot of pride in getting involved and helping them build their companies.
Okay, and what is the history behind Supernode? Like, how long has it been operating? How did you guys set it up? What's the history behind that?
So we set up in 2017. My previous life was as a film producer. I founded and ran a production company called Rooks Nest Entertainment. We built out a nice business for ourselves in indie film, and having left that business on good terms and doing well, it's still going strong today. I was really interested in the advent or the intersection of media and technology, and we set up a fund to focus on investing in that intersection. And as we've gone, there have been a couple of sort of key evolutions for us. One is that as we did our research, what we realized was that there was a tremendous value in the infrastructure piece around media. So what we focus on now in terms of the investing side of the business is media tech infrastructure is what we call it. You could say the enabling technologies around digital content. So really platforms and tools that are in that space. That's the main interest to us. The thing that enables the other content producers to go out and create good stuff, tools they use on the job, or platforms that they use to distribute their content on. That's really our main area of interest on the investing side.
So for the uninitiated, what would you consider to be such a platform or such a tool right now in the media spaces? Like some examples. I don't know, Twitch, or not necessarily ones that you're investing in, but like just to paint a picture of exactly what kind of technology we're talking about.
Absolutely. So on the consumer side, we would say that something like YouTube is an obvious example. YouTube, Netflix, Spotify, those big consumer companies, those are the types of platforms that we look for on the consumer side of things. With regards to, or indeed, going off into mobile games is another big area for us. Those some really interesting plays there. Those are the types of platforms on the consumer side that we look for. On the B2B side, which is really more tools, I guess the one that springs to mind is something like Unity. Creating a tool, a powerful tool that allows developers to go and create on it is something that's really close to our hearts. I would say Zencaster, which we're recording this podcast on, is another one. A great tool
Yeah.
and something that is allowing people to create content at a different level than they were before.
Yeah. In a lot of spaces, we have already big players, like you mentioned, YouTube, Spotify, Netflix. Like those are pretty huge, and maybe there is some space. I guess the first part of my question is, do you think that there's space in those spaces for new players? And what are some other spaces that are opening up for
hmm
businesses?
I think it really depends on how you look at it. If you're going into music streaming, do I think there's a great space there to create a consumer streaming platform in, music, or indeed with television, Netflix? No, I don't think that's a good idea to go straight up head to head with those guys. Maybe there's a niche here or a niche there, but the market's not going to be big enough really to warrant venture backing.
Mm-hmm.
Where I do think there are some really interesting plays directly in those spaces on the technology side. So, for instance, that may be to do with data, it may be to do with ad tech. There are some interesting plays within that. But what we really look for in terms of the bigger opportunities are around if not the paradigm shifting technologies, obviously there are huge opportunities there, then the sort of slightly more marginal shifts that open up spaces. So, for instance, on the big paradigm shifts, and what we look at are verticals, which are audio, video, gaming and interactive, and broadly speaking, text-based communications. And if there is a piece of hardware that is new to the market, that will open up either a brand new vertical to sit alongside it, or it will fundamentally shift the opportunities within that vertical. So there are two examples that spring to mind.
Mm-hmm.
One is AR, VR. When that hardware becomes mainstream, probably within the next 5 or 6 years, or at least significantly more mainstream than it is today, that will probably become a
Mm-hmm.
standalone vertical, which will allow for entirely new types of content to be created and with a whole
Yeah.
plethora of opportunities. A more recent example would be the explosion of in the audio space of Bluetooth headphones and specifically AirPods, and the
Mm-hmm.
spending time connected to technology in such a way that you probably weren't before. The data backs that up around the time spent wearing headphones, listening to audio, and so on. And those are two quite different shifts, but they open up some equally compelling opportunities in many respects. So with the AirPods, you then all of a sudden have the opportunity for an audio social network, and we've made an investment in that space. Obviously, Clubhouse has come along and done very, very well. That's a super
Mm-hmm.
interesting area, but also something that's interesting within that is not just the big consumer plays, but then all of a sudden you have the B2B tools that come with that sort of mirror that increasing consumer interest, or you can then build very significant companies that cater towards businesses creating audio products. So that's very interesting to us, and that's really how we look at it in terms of future opportunities. So I don't know if that was part of the question. If you want me to talk about where certain themes that are coming up, or if that's a separate question that you want to ask.
Sure, absolutely. Go for it. You can talk about the themes. Go for it.
So different themes, different opportunities that are coming up. You'll get different answers from different members of our team, because
Okay.
ultimately, not that we disagree, then we think that one theme or one thesis isn't necessarily strong, but because we, as an investing team, we all have different interests.
Yeah.
We focus on different things. I think in terms of technological shifts that you're looking towards right now, there are some very clear ones, and they result in different opportunities. One, as I said, was AR, VR, which I expect to become a vertical all on its own, where very unique types of content or new types of content are created for it in the future. The other is blockchain. And we're starting to see that obviously with NFTs, digital art, and so on blockchain, which opens up new business models, which is a huge driver of value and an opportunity for actually, I believe that business models are possibly the biggest new business models, the biggest tool for overcoming incumbents in many ways, alongside new technology.
Okay.
That's a slightly different point. The and then things AI, obviously, from a content perspective, the one that leaps off the page is synthetic media. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with.
Synthetic media.
Synthetic media is the most well publicized, most well known version of synthetic media is deepfakes. So it's
Okay.
deepfakes are I'm sure you've come across some of them, whether they're
Mm-hmm.
completely doctored photos or there was recently that Tom Cruise video where he was performing magic tricks. All those things, particularly the videos, which can't be easily sort of photoshopped, are usually driven by AI, and they're very convincing. A lot of people were convinced that Tom
Mm-hmm.
Cruise really can do magic, and maybe he can, but it wasn't him in the video. There was other.
Yeah, I remember like a few years ago, that technology came out where you could kind of, I don't know how it works, so I might be using the wrong words, but like you kind of superimposed a mouth, or you animated a mouth, and like Obama was speaking, and it was his voice, but it wasn't really him saying all that stuff, and it
Exactly.
looked super convincing.
Well, actually, with Obama, I think I'm right in saying that it was not his voice, and that was the most important part of the synthesis, was the fact that he had never said any of those things. There are companies out there. Lyrebird is one of them. I think Lyrebird may have actually been the company that did that clip,
Mm-hmm.
which can create or replicate voices completely. So you can get that voice to say
Yeah,
anything
like
you
it
want.
sounded like him, but it wasn't his voice. Like
It
I think they
wasn't
had like the AI had collected a lot of clips of, or
exactly.
listened to a lot of clips of him speaking, and then just recreated it,
It,
which was scary.
exactly. So deep fakes are, and there'll be an entire industry around that, around not just deep fakes, but also deep fake monitoring, and so on. Maybe not a huge industry, but that will be more of a part of the conversation in the years to come, for sure.
Yeah.
And there's a cybersecurity element to that, which is very interesting. So that's an opportunity. In terms of more practical use cases within media, there are a bunch of really, really interesting startups, some of whom are allowing using synthetic media to create media personalities, like Lil Michaela,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah, I she popped up on my Instagram recently. Like I've heard of her before, and it's like I have so many mixed feelings about that.
it's niche right now, but I think there is opportunity for it to grow, into, particularly as a use case in gaming right now, where you can. I just think that especially once they're able to, the voice element is going to be recreating realistic voices is going to be the kind of last bastion, because it's the hardest thing to do technologically.
Mm-hmm.
Once that is done, I think there's a lot of possibilities for the types of both good and bad content that you can create using synthetic media, because you have complete control over a
Yeah.
realistic humanoid type
Mm-hmm. Entity of some
entity
kind.
that doesn't need to eat, that doesn't need to sleep, that doesn't need to get paid,
That doesn't talk back.
that doesn't talk back. There's some, I mean, those are the sort of slightly dystopian versions of it, but there are some really interesting creative possibilities. And of course, with all these technologies, the best thing about them is that really smart people will take them and use them in ways that the people that created those technologies could not possibly have imagined. And that's what's really exciting about
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Earlier, you mentioned that within your team, you have a lot of different
them.
interests in terms of, probably what you want to invest in. When you decided to invest in media tech, was this
Hmm.
more like a personal interest thing? You were like, oh, this stuff is cool. I want to play around here. Or was it more like business decision, like this shit's going to go well, like this is a safe and sound thing to invest in?
A little bit of both. I would say it's probably More the former, certainly very early on when I was originally thinking about it. With my background, I was interested in, always interested in media and storytelling. I was in that world in film for a while, so understood it, I think, at least to a degree. And when I left the film business, I was looking around at other areas, and I didn't find those other areas as nearly as interesting.
What were those areas that you didn't find interesting?
I mean, just, more typical, whether it was looking at
Mhm.
stuff in the public markets or real estate,
Mhm.
just trying to be a
Mhm.
bit more sensible
Right.
after coming out of the film industry, a bit more grown up. I
They
thought
buy
that's what adults
properties.
do. And then had already been, yeah, I had already been invested in about 12 or 13 startups already across a range of industries. And even looking at those industries, whether it was fintech or deep tech or whatever, um, they just didn't grab my attention in
Mhm.
the same way. And I couldn't shake the kind of media content storytelling bug. And actually, when I was in film, towards the end of my time, probably from, I don't know, 2012, 2013 onwards, we had started selling quite regularly to the streaming services and had seen firsthand the rise of Netflix and Amazon in that industry to becoming the number one and number two buyers. So that was actually already something that was on my radar and interesting, was seeing the convergence between media and tech happening live. So I was very interested, and early on I was like, I would much rather invest in the next Netflix or Spotify or Amazon or what have you. And Amazon obviously is slightly outside of our remit, but at least in terms of the video concept, I would much rather invest in those businesses than sell films to them. And that's what we've kind of been, if not chasing, at least exploring
Mhm.
since then. So, in answer to your question, as it turned out, sorry, it's a bit of a roundabout answer, but
Okay.
as it turned out, there were very few other players in this space investing in early stage media tech businesses. Very, very few. No others that had that specialty in the UK and Europe at that time,
Okay.
and even very few in the US. So it turned out that even though it was my instinct and my preference to go after this sector, it also turned out to be a good business decision, because there's just not that, and there still isn't today, very few funds that really specialize in this area.
Why do you think that is? Is it because they don't understand it, or it's like why?
I mean, firstly, the history of VC started off as a specialist asset class in and of itself, and so there was no such thing as, for many years, being able to specialize within venture, because it was a specialty itself. uh, you were a tech investor, and it didn't matter where that was. And that is still very much the case for the biggest firms today. They are generalist uh, investors. What happened was, as the venture community matured, and more money flowed into the system, there was an opportunity to start building niche businesses focusing on investing in certain sectors. And around the same time we started, that was when it was starting to get popular, if not a little bit before, for having sector specific VCs that are focused on. But I guess what I'm saying is, to be focused on any particular sector is still not the status quo within venture capital. It's still very much dominated by
Mhm.
generalists. Within that, I would say that technology crosses every single sector. It's a vast landscape, and so it could be that you may pick uh, agri-tech as an example, as a way. You might be the only fund in the world that focuses on it. It's a,
Mhm.
I don't know, $60 trillion market or something. It's a huge market. You might pick travel. You might pick. There's
Yeah.
so many opportunities for specialism within technology investing, that the chances of more than a few players at this stage, more than a few players specializing in that, are fairly slim. There are some exceptions to that, like fintech, like blockchain technologies that are attracting a lot of people. But there are tons of other opportunities out there for people to build investment funds that are focused on a particular sector and not have very much competition, because the world of technology is so vast. There are generalist funds out there who are very good in media, but they do not only focus on media. Ones that spring to mind, the first that spring to mind is Andreessen Horowitz. Particularly in gaming, they do spend a lot of time in that space, but it's not the only thing that they do.
Okay, gotcha. What does the process look like of finding investments? I mean, is it like that you guys are out there, hunting for new startups? Do they come to you? What does it look like?
It depends. The benefit of the community is that we see a lot of startups early, and as we build the community, which is a fairly new thing, we only launched it towards the end of last year. As we build it, what we're seeing is that is more and more deal flow coming through the community. So that's a huge part of our flywheel, and will be moving forward. The other aspects of deal flow, the best quality deal flow comes from the work that we do in-house to develop a thesis and then go out and hunt for startups that match that thesis, and we go out and find them. But I would say the bulk of the deals that come through are just either sent through by other investors or founders that we know. They're inbound, and also cold inbounds as well. So people who are just reaching out, sending us a deck. That's probably inbound is where we get most of our deal flow. But I would say the best quality stuff comes from the work that we do in-house, and then we go out and hunt for those startups, as well as the stuff that comes through the community.
And what makes a startup appealing? Like, what kind of, I don't know, do you have like a little checklist that, a startup has to check for it to be, yes, we'll accept you, or no, we won't?
We do actually have that checklist, and we don't use it. We did a big piece of research in 2018 where we looked at all media companies that had exited for over $500 million, excluding IPOs. And the reason for that was to get to grips with the question that you're talking about, really understand or try to understand what makes a great company and what is visible at the start of that company. Something that was very important was to make sure that we weren't looking at companies that had exited and then seeing what they were like at the end and pretending that that's what they were like at the beginning. We were trying to see what are the visible points that are worth looking out for at the beginning of a company's life. And that was a really useful exercise. That was the exercise that keyed us in on investing in infrastructure rather than in content companies themselves. But it also narrowed our thinking in terms of what to look for in a productive way. It has changed since then, and we did create a checklist, and we now use it much less as a criteria, much more as just a sort of guide for our general thinking. What we really look for now is, the first thing is team. Does the team have a really great understanding of what the vision for the company is, and does particularly the CEO or the whoever the key founder is, do they understand the vision? Do they also understand the steps that are required to get there, and do they have absolute conviction in themselves and the people around them to do it? So it's, what I like to say is that, do they understand what A to Z looks like, as well as what A to B to C looks like? And it doesn't matter if the actual path to Z changes along the way. What matters is that you have clarity over how you're going to get there at any one time. That may change. You may need to pivot. You may need to shift the business, whatever. But as long as you have absolute clarity over what you're doing today, tomorrow, and in a year's time, that is really, really important. So somebody who has that vision to see the big picture, but also the small details, that's not easy to come by. It's a very particular type of person, I think, who can do that effectively.
Okay.
And then, of course, infuse it in the people around them,
Mm-hmm.
and be a good leader. So that's the key. And also, have they surrounded themselves with good people? Do they have a
Yeah.
good balance and a good experience in this? The second thing that we really look for is value proposition. So, are you creating a product that will lend tangible value to its users? Is it going to help them make money? Is it going to help them save time? Is it going to help them do something that they otherwise wouldn't be able to do at all, in a meaningful way? Is it 10x better than the competitors that are on? Whichever value proposition you go after, it has to lend meaningful value to people's lives that are using the product. So yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of great tools out there.
Mm-hmm.
My personal favorite value proposition is helping people make money or save time, because I think those are two incredibly, or indeed save money.
Mm-hmm.
Those are three incredibly powerful levers to pull. So those are my favorite ones. But there are a bunch of others that we look at, and generally speaking, we're not super strict on that sort of stuff. But you can't just be making just another widget or a gimmicky thing that isn't going to stick around and be really
Mm-hmm.
valuable to people. And also, I would say that you have to understand that your perception of the value of your product may differ from how the market perceives it. So you've got to kind of prove that there is a strong enough desire in the market. You're not just making it for 5 people that are going to love it. You've got to make it for, a lot more than 500 million people. There's got to be a huge market. And that's the third thing that we look at is market.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're making a niche product, which is fine, you have to make sure that that niche is big enough. And you cannot afford to be a number 2 player in a niche market. You have to be the number 1 player.
Yeah.
If it's a much bigger market, then that's great. Then that gives you a little bit more room to breathe, but it does mean it's going to be more competitive. So then you have to look at defensibility, which is the last of the things that we really focus on, is how defensible is your business, whether it's a business model, technology, brand, etc. So those are kind of the key things that I would say. There are other factors like exit potential that we look at. And I guess one last thing to mention that I think is not necessarily definitive in terms of how we view the business, but it is the thing that gets you most excited most quickly, which is traction. It's very unlikely that we will invest in a
Mm-hmm.
business that doesn't have any kind of traction whatsoever, because we like to see that people want this, and it's just something that
Yeah.
helps demonstrate that you're getting the other points right, and that people want your product and are using it, and so on. And if I would say, if there was a way to work yourselves into our heads as investors, demonstrating great traction is the way to do it. The rest of the deck could look like a shambles, but if you've got the numbers, you're going to be taken seriously.
So, if a shitty deck isn't a deal breaker, what is a deal breaker?
It's definitely not a deal breaker. I would like to think we're a little bit more sophisticated than that, but it's not a good look, I have to say. But if you've got great numbers, all of that goes out the window, and you then start taking it a lot more seriously. In terms of what a deal breakers for us, the first thing that comes to mind, which is super important, is if company does not match with our values and ethics as a firm, which is something that we're in the process of codifying, with certainly something that we have a strong opinion about. It's not something we're not a social enterprise investor, but we do have a strong sense of wanting to back companies that are creating a positive impact. And we do have a way of defining that. We have seen the negative impact that media can have quite recently. We've also seen the positive impact. It's something that we look at as holistically as we possibly can. And we think in many ways that companies operating in content and media, it's not properly understood how big their impact is. And it's only now that as a society we're starting to have that question and that conversation, particularly right now around social media. But it will come to other parts of the ecosystem as well. And we want to back companies that are aligned with us in that regard. And want to make a positive impact. So that for us is the number one deal breaker. If we don't think that they align with those set of values, we won't invest no matter how great the company is.
Okay, that's fair. I like that. That's a good way to approach it, I think. I don't want to talk about it too much, but I'm always curious because we all know what kind of year we've had in 2020. And I wanted to know from your perspective, how did the pandemic influence the media industry and also VCs and their willingness to invest?
I'll tackle the first one first. How did it affect the media industry? In a multitude of ways, I would say. Historically, media always had pretty good beta, which is the volatility is not that high through good times and bad. And it has been proven, fairly regularly through downturns that people watch or consume, if not the same amount of content and media as they did before, then even more. We saw that in 2008, where film revenues at the time, film and TV stayed very stable or even grew in some areas. People can't afford to go out, or in this case, in the pandemic, can't even go out in the first place, even if they can afford it, to go to a restaurant or to go to a pub or whatever it may be. In their downtime, so they stay in and watch a movie or play a game or whatever it may be. So there is historical precedent for media being fairly okay during these sorts of times. The difference in this time was, even though that was the case, what we saw in media, we saw in other areas in technology, is that it forced certain parts of the industry to adapt a lot more quickly than they otherwise would have, particularly thinking about streaming in terms of the big studios and adopting streaming. Disney got very lucky with their timing of the launch of Disney Plus, but also people spending more time on mobile games and just games, video games in general, live streaming and so on. There was obviously a big boost, and so that's something that we saw. We saw a very significant bump across a lot of areas of the industry, and certain trends, as we've seen, whether it's, online fitness or video conferencing, calls, events, whatever it may be. And there's a whole list of different sectors within media we were already starting to see take off, that just got significantly accelerated by it, probably by a couple of years. So, we saw that across technology and media. It was particularly pertinent. And that's what we saw. I would say the one negative has been a slight, what's the right word? A slight skepticism because of some of the significant growth that has happened during the pandemic in certain sectors. There's then this kind of counter skepticism, if you will, of, are they only getting this type of traction, this type of growth because of the pandemic? And that's a story that founders are having to tell, and it is causing some trouble in terms of raising money because people aren't sure how much it'll carry on after the pandemic. So that is the one sort of downside to it. But generally, it's been a very, very positive period of time for media tech businesses. And to answer your second question about VC, last year was our busiest year ever in terms of doing deals. I think in Q2, when everything was happening around the beginning of the pandemic here, it was our busiest ever quarter. It was just one of those things where we had already gotten quite used to doing things remotely or virtually in terms of doing deals. So that wasn't something that we as a firm had to get used to. We'd already done it a number of times, and we just kept rolling as normal, or busier than normal, as it turned out. With the rest of the venture community, I would say in general it was a quieter Q2 last year as VC firms got to grips with what was happening. But then in Q3, you started to see it pick up again, and by Q4 it was at blazing levels, if you will, and that's carried on. So in terms of the bigger picture, really hasn't affected the VC industry negatively.
Let me ask you, because we're almost out of time. The question is there any investments that you didn't make and that you're upset about?
Oh yeah, there are tons. I'm not gonna name names, but there are definitely a lot, and I'm sure there always will be. And that's been one of my biggest learnings since coming into the industry, is that it's the check that you don't write is a lot
Mm-hmm.
more painful than if that company goes on and does very well, a lot more painful than the check that you do write and that company fails. You know, we're at this point a relatively small fund, although we obviously have ambitions to grow.
Sure.
We have limited resources, which is a blessing in many respects. But it
Mm-hmm.
also does mean that we have to be we can't write every single check under the sun. There are certain big firms who catch on to a certain thesis
Mm-hmm.
or a certain idea, and they really believe in that market, and they can then go out and back multiple players in that market. We don't have that luxury, so we have to try and pick the best one. You know,
Mm-hmm.
that's an exciting thing to have to try and do. It's a real challenge, and I'm learning now that that we need to be, or have learned since I got into this industry, that you know you can't afford to be cautious. You have to be an optimist. You have to be a risk taker,
Okay.
and you know you have to trust your instinct, and that's where the team comes in, and trust in the team that is so important, because you never know. It's very difficult to tell, okay, this company is going to make it, but this company isn't at such an early stage. And you have to trust that the team is going to find a
Mm-hmm.
way through whatever problems that come up. And I think it's pretty unusual for a seed investor to invest in a company and that company goes for 10 years and it looks the same at that end of 10 years or 15 years, whatever it is, and it looks the same at the end of that period of time than it did at the beginning, in terms of what they were trying to accomplish and what the product was and so on. These companies go through huge changes, um, and you need to trust that the founder, the CEO, the team are going to find a way through those changes and come out stronger. So that's been the kind of one key learning for me coming, you know,
Yeah.
from coming into this industry to now, is, you know, if all else checks out, you're able to kind of get a sense of the value proposition in the market and so on. And it's just, do I believe that this person can build a great company?
Gotcha. What advice would you give um, to someone who would like to work in this kind of business, in a VC and investing in companies?
In terms of on the investing side, or as a startup founder?
The investing side, like someone wants to work at a VC and find cool companies to invest in.
What advice I would have in terms of them, how to get into the industry or what to do once they're there?
Yeah, how to get in.
I think the you know, there's generally, if you were on the West Coast, that path, maybe, you know, go to Stanford and then go and find a job in a reputable firm as a kind of, you know, going lower down and working your way through. I still think that's a viable way of doing it if you can, you know, getting an entry level job at, you know, a meaningful firm, and working your way up is still very much a viable way of a path of getting into the industry. And obviously, frankly, I didn't take that path, so I don't know exactly what it takes. I'd be lying if I said I did. But
Yeah.
you know, I would imagine it takes a lot of hunger and desire. And for me, when we're hiring into our firm, which is also now a viable, you know, picking a seed fund or a slightly smaller fund and coming in, and if you want to work in a smaller team and have more responsibility, that's very much a viable opportunity for you to take. It helps if you have operational experience.
Hmm.
You know, you've either started a company or have been an early employee at a startup. That's obviously helpful, but it's not the only way. And you may be coming through a consultancy or a different background. You know, maybe coming out of an investment bank, whatever it may be. I guess my one piece of advice would be, have a really big passion for startups and technology. Know your stuff. Don't, there's not just a day job. You've
Hmm.
got to kind of
Okay.
live and breathe it and be really excited about it. And it's you can tell when people are excited about the industry. They want to write about it, they want to read about it, they want to talk about it. And that is really, really important in terms of forming your knowledge base of what's going on. You've got to read, the trade journals. You've got to read TechCrunch. You've got to be on top of the news that's happening and understand and have a mental picture of types of startups that are being successful at that time, and why, and have a take on it. And I think that is, writing about things or posting about it on social media. It's another way. If you have interesting takes on businesses, it's another way to get attention. But that would be my number one thing is you've got to be passionate about this area. You've got to know your stuff. When you come in for an interview with any firm, you've got to understand the role. You've got to show them, particularly on an investment side, if this is what I could do from this is where I would be investing and why. Basically having an in-depth knowledge of any particular area that you're talking about, or relatively in-depth, is important.
And what's the advice you would give to your younger self?
Being honest, I would, in a similar vein to what I was just talking about, I would advise my younger self to be more curious. Learning opens up so many opportunities.
Okay.
And now with the internet, and even, from a traveling perspective, I know it's not possible right now, but travel is pretty cheap. Travel is an amazing way to learn about new cultures, reading, listening to podcasts, whatever it is. And not just necessarily technology, but just be more interested in the world around you from an earlier point, and not just focused on whatever it is that you're doing, but just be curious about things, and that will open up a lot more opportunities than you can possibly imagine. That would be the advice to my younger self.
I like that. Be curious. That's a good one. And on that wonderful note, we will finish off. Mike, thanks so much for joining me today. Have a great day.
Thanks very much, Kate. Cheers.